We are. So hello everyone on Facebook Live as well. This is a very exciting first introduction to the Artist in Residence programme, which is going to involve me working with the art Bridge Emergents to create some new work at Western Arboretum. So I'm just going to start with a little backstory about my practice as an artist, which is about 20 years worth of work. We're going to condense that into a very brief history. I do go to the beginnings. There's something very important about the beginning that then informed the trajectory of my work in the public arena and also my values and sensibilities and interests as an artist. So I'm going to start with this piece, which was the first public commission I had. It was about 23. It was a year after I'd finished art school. And this was a commission for the Royal Festival Hall in London. I worked on this project with another artist and a friend of mine called Dot Howard, who created a series of performances around the Royal Festival Hall, while I made this big steel, aluminium and plastic cubicle, this big structure that's in the foyer there. Now, this piece of work is called Sealed Flow because it's got a flow of water running through the middle of the structure. So these areas here are made from polycarbonate plastic, which is sometimes used in conservatories. So it's got two layers of plastic with an air space in the middle. And I had water running through the middle of the plastic so that as you came up to the structure and walked through it, if you took your time, you might notice little droplets of water running down the walls of this installation. And there's several reasons why I constructed it in this way. The backstory is that at the time, the Royal Festival Hall was undergoing some big refurbishments. And so Dot and I were there to create some work in the public spaces to sort of brighten things up while they had areas closed off and refurbishments going on. And I found out that as part of the refurbishments, they were going to build a big new production house next door that would fit onto the railway arches for the Hungerford Bridge that crosses the Thames right next to the Royal Festival Hall. So they had this beautiful design of this kind of sleek glass and steel oblong shaped building, which they were calling the Liner Building. And in order to build that building, they had to demolish some parts of the railway arches. And one of the things they took down was a little red brick water tower from the Victorian era that would have originally been used to pump water out of the Thames and to fill up the steam trains as they were going out of London. And I was quite taken by this little water tower and a bit sad to see it going. And I thought I'd like to make a piece of public sculpture that draws the layers of history together, that kind of pays homage to or celebrates the Victorian water tower as a layer of history underneath this steel and glass liner building, this production house. So that's where the aesthetic, the look and the material choices for this artwork came from. And I mentioned it was also at a time of change, of refurbishment, a part of time for the Royal Festival Hall where one thing was ending and a new beginning was happening. Similarly for me, I was a new graduate, so my art school education had finished and I was kind of in this space of working out who I was and what I did as a professional artist. So a place of flux, of change. I use the word of a liminal space, a place between two different things. And what I wanted to create in this installation is an experience of being in a liminal space, a place that's partly covered, partly open, a threshold between one thing and another, a quiet place that you can walk through and feel a bit of privacy and just reflect and contemplate with those gently dripping bits of water coming down through the inside of the walls. One of the things about working in a public building is making sure that you're designing it to be accessible for as many people as possible. So originally this idea had steps to access it. You'd go up a couple of steps and then into the sculpture. But we decided in working with the technical crew at the Royal Festival Hall that it was really important to make it accessible to people in wheelchairs. So what I had to do is change the designs to make the opening wider so that it could fit a wheelchair through. And we put a ramp in that had the right gradient to make it safe for wheelchair use, so it wasn't too steep. And it's one of those things where I think the problem actually becomes a really good solution that enhances the artwork, because it feels much more dramatic with these big ramps coming off of it, and it means you take more time in coming up it and entering that liminal space of the work itself. So all in all, this work was a great success. It got press in London. Dot and I launched a business together. It was really successful. But what happens at the end of that project is I kind of had a bit of a crisis of conscience. And I started to think about all the people that had helped me to make it, all the materials that had been used in making it, and particularly the industrial processes involved in making steel, aluminium smelting, a lot of natural resources, a lot of fossil fuels to create really high temperatures, a lot of water to cool the material as it's being worked. And the same with the polycarbonate plastic, you know, the chemicals and the industrial processes to make that plastic. When I thought about all of those things, I felt really uncomfortable, and I wasn't sure that I could justify being an artist who used up all those resources to create temporary installations, which, you know, what would happen to them afterwards. So I started looking at different kinds of materials and the way different materials were made, and seeing if I could find materials that were more environmentally friendly. And it was really a conundrum, because everything comes from somewhere. Everything has a process of how it's extracted from the earth or how it's made. And it wasn't a really easy answer. I sort of buried my head a little bit. I took some time out to go and volunteer on Hackney Marshes, working at their tree nursery there, planting lots of little acorns to grow oak trees, which is the picture you can see. It's on my left here. All of these little baby oak trees that we were growing from seed, and also working with groups of school children to plant trees and hedges around Hackney's green spaces. This turned out to be a really important time for me. I spent 2 or 3 years working on Hackney Marshes at the tree nursery, learning about tree identification, how to care for trees. This is where I began teaching. I had absolutely no intention of becoming a teacher, but through these workshops with the children and young people of Hackney, I started to develop my skills as a workshop leader, which has continued ever since. I've made quite a lot of my income as a teaching artist working with school children and community groups. So this time on Hackney Marshes was hugely important for me. And although it didn't yield the answers to what's the best materials to work with as an artist, it brought me much closer to the natural world and set a trajectory for my work, which has continued ever since. So that's why I wanted to kind of go right the way back to this time period as I'm introducing my work today and the work that we're going to be doing at the Arboretum, the Westonbirt Arboretum together. So like I said, after a few years on Hackney Marshes, I was very lucky to get a scholarship to study a Master of Fine Arts at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. This was called the Turon Award, which was 2 years fully funded stay in the States, all my tuition fees and all my living expenses covered. So it was with great excitement, very, very excited to go off to Philadelphia and start a new chapter of my life there. When I got there, one of the first things I did was start to research a bit about the city that was my new home and see what things about Philadelphia might be interesting for me to explore as an artist. Philadelphia is a very interesting city. It's one of the oldest first ones that was formed. I think it's where the Constitution was written and where the Declaration of Independence was signed. And it turns out it's also the first city in America to have a pumped water system. So obviously, day to day, most of us are used to kind of going to the kitchen, turning on the tap, getting some water out of it. But if you think back to times when that wasn't possible, and America being kind of founded as a country, the first city to have pipes put in to bring water to people's homes was Philadelphia. And I discovered that those water pipes were made from trees. They were made from logs that had been hollowed out and carried the water from the nearby River Schuylkill through to the homes and the areas of residential living in Philadelphia. So I thought, well, that's a good starting point, because, you know, I'd done this work with the water and I'd been really interested in the trees, and trees themselves, I know, carry water up through the roots, through their xylem and phloem tubes that live underneath the bark. And the water carries sugars and nutrients through the plant to help it grow. So water's already an important element within trees' growth and in wood. And it's also an important element in our own bodies. I think human beings are 80% water. So as I started to think about these things, what I discovered was a method called steam bending that is using water and steam, heated water, to shape wood into beautiful curving forms. So I worked with the wood technicians at the University of Pennsylvania, and I talked to a nearby timber yard and had a 9-foot cherry tree felled. They put it into planks for me, and then I brought it back to home and cut it into sections using a handheld jigsaw so that I could follow the grain of the wood, and that would make it easier to form in steam bending so that it didn't break. Steam bending is a really interesting process. What we basically did was put the wood in a hot box and piped loads of steam in there, a bit like a sauna. So the pieces of cherry wood would sit in their sauna for about 5 hours, and then a whole team of people would help me take them out of the hot box with our gloves and our aprons on, wrap them around these big forms, this big jig, and then quickly strap them in place using this black metal strap here and these homemade brackets that we created. So this column is about 6 foot long, I think. So the pieces of cherry were twisted around there, and then you just let them cool down and dry. And the way that this process works is that when the wood gets heated by steam, all the molecules, the particles of wood, they sort of soften up and they spread out a bit so that the wood becomes malleable, movable, a bit like putty. And then you can wrap it and twist it and curl it. And as it dries out again, the fibers shrink back together and they hold that form. They hold it into the curving shapes without splitting and breaking it. So after it's dried out and kind of set again, then I can take those metal straps off, and really it's just a process of sanding it down and finishing it off, which then ended up looking something like a beautiful red colour, which I really loved. And this work was installed in a few different places around America. It ended up, it lives in Vermont now, but the final installation was sort of mimicking like flow forms, a bit like a stream, the way a stream twists and curls along. So creating shapes in the landscape that looked like a flow of water, but were actually made of wood. Research about the history of Philadelphia and this first pumped water supply, I came across an organisation called the Fairmount Waterworks Interpretive Centre. This is on the banks of the River Schuylkill, which provides the drinking water for Philadelphia. And so the big image here in the background, you can see some of that old pumping equipment, which was very exciting to me, in this sort of basement space with the concrete sort of crumbling off the walls. And actually, if you look out the window, the river is right there, right next to you. And there was a few different contemporary artworks installed in this pumping station. So I approached them about creating a piece of work, and we decided that I would work with a group of local Girl Scouts who were getting their Eco Action badge, and we create a temporary sculpture for World Water Day. So I met with the Girl Scouts and we decided we'd look at sort of river pollution and the importance of keeping the drinking water supply clear and clean by keeping all the surrounding areas, the fields, the mountains, the trees, keeping those free from pollutants so that there wasn't lots of toxic chemicals running through the earth into the rivers, and also trying to keep it free from litter. One of the things that we were all very interested in is this idea of the plastic water bottle, that you can get water from a tap, but so many people were using plastic water bottles where they drink the water, throw the bottle away, and it ends up in the ocean or in the landfill, polluting our water supplies. So we did a bit of a cleanup with the Girl Scouts. We did a litter pick, and they collected their plastic bottles from home and school as well. We cleaned them all up and we cut them into spirals to create this 16-foot or 5-meter installation of cascading water bottles flowing through the pumping station. I call this water bottle waterfalls because it sort of mimics again the flow of water, but instead of using wood this time, we were using plastic as a way to really help people to stop and think about single-use plastics and try and reduce the amount of pollutions going into the Philadelphia water supply. Now, this picture, this column might look a bit familiar to you. This is another piece of work I made in America that's basically that big jig, the big form that I was using to create the cherry wood spirals was sitting around the studio taking up a lot of space. And even though I built this jig myself, it was based on one of those old industrial cable spools. You might have seen them around sort of industrial sites before, which is basically like a circular structure that would have had wires and cables wrapped around it for industrial building uses. This one's a lot longer. We made it a lot longer to wrap the cherry wood around. But thinking about this idea of industrial detritus, really, things that were left behind from the industrial processes. And at the time I was engaged in a seminar about transformation, and I decided to look to the concept of alchemy, which is a mythological concept of being able to turn lead, as in the base metal, the heaviest metal of lead, into gold, the most precious of metals. And it's a metaphor for personal transformation and sort of spiritual transcendence or enlightenment, if you like, which is a concept that's very important to me in my personal life. So it was interesting to bring this into my work through the industrial language, if you like, of this cable spool. So the column here You can't see it very well, but it's actually got 7 different wires coming off of it, and they stretch right across the gallery space so that you can't pass through the gallery space. You have to go all the way around and in and out another entrance if you want to get from one side to the other. So it's really disrupting the space with these wires that correspond to the 7 stages of alchemical transformation. So those 7 metals there were mercury, lead, and then the alloy of tin and copper, silver, iron, and gold. I couldn't use mercury because it's a dangerous volatile metal, so I think I used zinc instead of that, but the metaphor was there. On top of the column, I planted a garden to signify the sort of triumph of nature over these industrial processes, this idea of nature reclaiming industrial wasteland. And being a Brit abroad, the first thing I did was put some English daisies in my garden and some azaleas. I put an ash tree in there because ash trees are sometimes called the pioneer species. They're one of the first trees colonize a regrowth area, one of the first trees to start the beginning of a forest. And then I put some broccoli and some strawberries in there for the idea of sustenance or nourishment, of humans taking food from the earth, basically. And this garden is sitting above the industrial cable spool. It's even sitting above the golden wire, the zenith of alchemical transformation, almost like a sort of mini Garden of Eden up there, as this idea to bring us in touch with nature as the highest form of spiritual nourishment, and also like overcoming frustration, really. I'm going to skip 4 years now to living back in England and being awarded an artist in residence role at Kimbolton School, which is in Huntingdonshire in east of England. And when I went to visit them, it's the most grand and beautiful building. It looks like a castle. And it used to be the home of King Henry VIII. It's got these fantastic frescoes painted on the wall by a famous artist called Pellegrini. And it's got a sort of large grounds, large landscape with this avenue of trees that come down the middle of it. And I was only going to be there for a week. And it's such a grand building. I thought, my goodness, what on earth could I make in this environment that's going to stand out against this castle, essentially? And I looked at the trees, and these trees on this avenue were tall. They were really big trees. And I discovered that they were imported from America in the 1850s. They're called giant sequoia trees, which is very similar to the redwoods in West Coast America, sometimes also called Wellingtonia trees. And these trees can be 200 or 300 feet high. What I discovered about these trees is that they don't send their roots really deep into the ground to help them stand up. They spread their roots out across the surface of the ground, out by a long, long way, so that they almost make like a carpet of roots just underneath the sort of topsoil. And that's how they anchor themselves and are able to grow to 200 or 300 feet without falling over. Excuse me. So I thought, right, well, that sounds like an interesting one. I can spread my sculpture out across the grounds and make an impact that way. And I used these Wellingtonia tree roots as a point of inspiration. And you can see in the sculpture there, what I did was I started off with the concentric rings of tree growth. You know, like if you cut a tree in half, you can see the rings of how it's grown. That was the basis for this sculpture. And then I built these curving shapes coming out of it to represent the roots, the root patterns of the giant sequoia trees. And I didn't have the budget or the time that I had in America when I was making the cherry wood steam bent sculptures. So I made this piece very quickly out of hardboard, which is very thin. It's just a few millimeters thick. And hardboard is essentially sawdust and glue squished together. And I covered it in waterproof coating, but it's still not very strong. So what happened when we installed this outside and it rained is that all the curving shapes actually changed when they got wet, but they changed in a very beautiful, symmetrical way so that every single one of them was looking the same. And that's how I gave this sculpture its name, Double Bend, because before it rained, they were single arches, and after it rained, they were double bends. And this sculpture quite unwittingly became responsive to the climate and to the environment around it. It changed with the changing weather in the school grounds, which was one of those happy accidents, I think. I could never have planned it. It was really beautiful and quite an enhancement to my original idea. And with this hardboard being very thin and essentially made of sawdust and glue, over time, it lasted through the summer, but once it got to the autumn and it was raining more, then the hardboard started to disintegrate and break up, and the sculpture went back into the ground in the same way of a life cycle of a tree would disintegrate back into the ground at the end of its life. Quite a lot of my work is for temporary installations, so it was very fun, I think, to be playing with the effects of rain and wind and sun on the sculpture. This is another piece that was created for a festival in Hackney Wick a year after Double Bend. And Hackney Wick is an old industrial area with a lot of warehouses, kind of old car yards, broken concrete, barbed wire. And it's also an area that's been home to artists for probably about 20 years, possibly 25 years. And in 2011, I was invited to take part in their annual artists festival called Hackney Wicked. And when I went to see the site, it felt very desolate. It was taking place on a wasteland with, like I said, broken concrete. It felt very kind of heavily polluted. There was a lot of industrial contamination on the area. And I chose for that festival to install a mirror in the ground, a circular mirror that created what looked like a hole of blue sky in this broken concrete. And on that mirror, there was 100 glass marbles. One of those marbles was the fusion of two spheres stuck together, which you can see in the image there. And for me, this was the idea of the marriage of earth and sky, bringing the reflection of the sky into the earth, into the concrete for this festival, but also the kind of epitome of union of two things joining together, the marriage of earth and sky, but also the union that creates life, you know, the egg and the sperm that come together to create an ovum. And the first stage of growth in a new life is that the cell will split into two, it will divide, and then it will multiply. So this little joint sphere here could be a moment of coming together, a union, or it could be a moment of new beginning where things start to split open into new life. And again, that was both, I think, for me, a metaphor for personal transformation and transcendence and relationship with the earth and the sky together. I'm throwing this one in because it will become relevant to the work that we're at Westonbirt. I think it's part of my idea for how we might work together in the coming weeks. And it was interesting to find myself back in Hackney after those beginning days in the tree nursery. I lived back in London for a few more years. And in 2017, I was invited by Canal and River Trust to create a piece of community artwork to celebrate the industrial heritage of the River Lee, to bring the local community together around the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, and to celebrate the multicultural communities that live there, particularly focusing on the Bangladeshi community, and doing that with of Rangoli patterns. So Rangoli is the circular motif you can see in the middle there, that's is familiar in Bangladesh, but also other parts of Asia as well. Pakistan and India would also use these Rangoli patterns as a form of celebration. And in creating this work, I got to go on a boat trip down the River Lee and the surrounding canals and learn all about the history of the site, which was really interesting to me, because when I worked at the tree nursery, that was before the Olympic site was built. And then I went to America, and when I came back from America, the Olympic Park was well underway. So it was really interesting to come back to this community quite a few years later and see how the area had changed, and see how people's relationship to the area had changed. On this exploratory boat, I discovered that the canals were used to bring timber up from the docklands. The timber would come from overseas on big ships. It would come up the Thames, it would be unloaded in the docklands and then put onto barges and transported across the UK. And this particular network of canals and the River Lee that run through East London would often be the thoroughfare for barges that were carrying logs and timber. So what happened is a lot of furniture factories grew up along the banks of the river and the banks of the canal. And you can find sort of remnants of those factories in the area. There was also a cotton factory there, and right in the middle of the Olympic Park, there used to be a sweet factory. So these were some of the kind of like starting bits of research for this project. And then working with local community groups, local schools, taking part in local summer fetes, working with all kinds of different people, we started to hear about how people were using the park now, and also bring in some of the kind of re-greening efforts that had taken place by planting wildflowers along the edges, offering pleasure boat trips. So within these Rangoli patterns, even though they look just like colours and shapes from a distance, actually close up, they were all handmade by members of the public using lino print. So what we did is we would print these lino motifs in circular repetitive patterns, and the lino cuts themselves would relate to the industrial history. So you can see the sort of factory there and the barge, and then also that kind of mixing of industrial and natural environment, again with the swans and the wildflowers. And this was a really successful way of working. I think about 400 people got involved in this project, and we made 55 meters of fabric banners, some of which are on permanent display at Hub 67 in Hackney Wick. So it's really great that they've stayed with the local community. Some people made individual flags, some people worked in pairs or groups to make bigger ones. And I found this was a really exciting community workshop that I've since been able to replicate in other places. So the green banner on the left here was created with 10 students at Hodge Hill College in Birmingham. And for that one, we introduced images of Birmingham's industrial heritage. So, like the Bourneville factory and other jewellery quarter, other key elements from Birmingham's past. And then in Stroud, which is where I am now, this time last year, I worked with Creative Sustainability on a series of community workshops where we created flags and banners to hang along the canals in Stroud as part of the Wool and Water Festival that was celebrating the textile heritage of Stroud here. So that's sort of some of the ways that this themes of kind of natural triumph over industry has woven through my practice, and some of the ways that I've been able to work with different community groups to create these public installations. I'm going to pause here now, have a breath, let us all have a stretch. We'll stop the live stream, and then if the ArtBridge participants have any questions, we can have a few questions before I introduce the project at Westonbirt. Okay, welcome back everybody. I think we're live streaming again. I'm going to talk a little bit now about my ideas for this artist in residence at Westonbirt Arboretum. And really it's just the kind of beginning stages of my initial thoughts that might kind of spark ways that we can work together as a group, and how it relates to what's been going on for us over this past few months. So this presentation is called Lungs of the Earth, and through this residency I'm interested in exploring the relationship between trees and humans as that kind of reciprocal or symbiotic, the shared exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide as trees make oxygen, which is essential for humans to live by. This starting image here is one of my first pictures from lockdown, quite early on back in March when I was going for my daily exercise walks. I used to go at the end of the day, so after I'd been at the computer I'd have to go and have a stretch and a walk, and I'd quite often be out till it was getting dark. And one of my favourite times of day is when the colour kind of drains out of the sky and the birds come into roost. So I was walking home and I'm up in Robborough, there was a whole group of crows that were coming into roost in a tree above me, and they were chattering so loudly. And I think I'd just learnt that the sort of the genus, the name for crows as their species is corvids, and here they were kind of chattering away above my head, and I started to think, oh, there's got to be a joke there about the corvids chattering up in the trees. So plus they made a really great sound. I took a little video of them, and when I came home and looked at the video, I noticed that as I was looking up, the branches of the trees looked like branches of bronchioles inside the lungs. So I went back the next day and I took some more of those tree branches and started to think about that relationship between kind of humans needing oxygen to breathe, trees creating oxygen, and also the visual similarity between the lungs of a human and the branching shapes of a tree. And again, like, the trees have been really in my mind for the past few months. With, if you think back to pre-COVID times, we had those horrendous bushfires in Australia, and before that in Brazil and the Amazon rainforest, and also in parts of California and Canada. And without good tree cover on the planet, human life cannot be sustained, and we've lost catastrophic amounts of tree cover through those fires in the last 12 months. So thinking about ways that we can all protect our trees, plant trees, and really raise awareness about this essential relationship between trees and human life is a driving point within this residency for me, I think. So both metaphorically but also visually. And on this slide here you can see some of the different ways that I've been thinking about trees in relation to this residency and the time that we've been living in and we're coming out of now. So just to kind of go through the diagram, the branching idea I've already mentioned, and as you may have gathered from my previous work, I quite often look into science in my research stages. So looking at the molecular structure of things and the shapes that you can see in nature under a microscope, and relating those geometric shapes to the more organic forms of nature is perhaps something that we will explore through this residency. I'm also quite interested in this idea of as above, so below, that the tree itself is a mirror image. You know, you've got the trunk in the middle, down below you've got the roots spreading out, and up above you've got the branches and the leaves spreading out. And that in itself is a mirror image, and it's often used as a symbol known as the tree of life to represent kind of life force vitality as well. As you will have seen in my previous talk, there's also I've had a previous interest in using mirrors to link sky space and the space above us to the space in the earth. So that might be something that we can work with together to explore what I call tree space, the space of the canopies, the branches and the leaves, and what goes on up there. That personally, I've always wanted to climb trees. I had a back injury in 2013, and so I haven't been able to learn how to climb trees, but I love this idea of getting in canopy and what's up there. And if we can do that through visual tricks like exploring with periscopes or putting cameras up or using mirrors to reflect the canopy but down on the ground, then that's all kind of interesting ways that I'd like us to explore the landscape at Westonbirt when we get there. On again a sort of metaphorical level, what I discovered is that trees have been, there's lots of sort of stories and folk myth around trees to enhance well-being, whether that's medicinal compounds and using leaves or roots or bark for making medicines, or whether it's just kind of going out and having some time with the trees to feel good, to feel better, to calm down and to relax and to take some time in nature. So I think that element of using the space at Westonbirt and using our time with the trees to enhance our well-being is fantastic. It's really good at any time, but fundamental at this time as we're coming through a pandemic and living through so many changes. So I think we're actually really lucky to be working at Westonbirt at this time. And then also when I was putting this presentation together, it was partly when the guidelines for social distancing were changing and the government was starting to introduce this idea of bubbles, that you could connect with one or two people in a little social bubble. So I've been thinking about how we can work together and still stay safe in the environment at this time, and that vision of bubbles is something that we might want to explore. So this is a bit like my mood board, if you like. This is some of my starting thoughts and just a few kind of pictures to help explain those. Now, in terms of being at Westonbirt, one of the trees that I would be really excited to spend time with is the thuya trees. Now, these are the cedars. You get the Western red cedar, which I think is that big one down here at the bottom. You also get an Eastern white cedar, and they're very aromatic trees. Cedar is quite often used for incense. It can be used for like lining the drawers to make them smell nice in your house. Cedar trees are pretty big. You might have recognized already, I've got a bit of a fascination for giant trees, and cedars grow pretty big. And the other thing I discovered is that their seeds, which you can see in this little picture here, actually look a lot like the little air sacs inside our lungs, which are called alveoli. So you've got those branching bronchial tubes, but then in the lungs, But then inside of those, at the end of those, you've got these little air sacs called alveoli, and they group together. Sometimes people say they look like grapes, but they also look like the seeds of the cedar trees. And I also discovered that in sort of folk medicine, cedar is used as a anti-inflammatory to help combat respiratory conditions. So the cedar tree, its oil in particular, in folk medicine is used to help with breathing disorders. So if we're talking about the relationship between trees and good breathing, this is like the best tree to be working with, I think. I'm hoping that you will also find your own personal relationships to the trees at Westonbirt. You by no means have to follow the ones that I'm interested in. This is sort of an example of the different ways we can get to know the trees and find out more about their individual properties and personalities, and hopefully all build our own relationships to the trees while we're on site there. So you might have other trees that interest you that you want to research and make artwork about. Now, I've touched on this idea of scientific structures, that molecules and putting things under microscopes, and how the structures that make things are quite interesting to me. And particularly finding geometric shapes, you know, triangles, circles, rectangles, hexagons in the natural environment, because quite often we can think of nature as being organic or chaotic or unorganized, but actually there's some very ordered principles of how things grow that relate to sacred geometry, which are these specific mathematical relationships between shapes that show up all the time in nature. So I'm interested in exploring those a bit more, and perhaps with this social bubble idea, perhaps creating some kind of dome structure. There's a architect, artist, visionary called Buckminster Fuller, who first created these geodesic dome structures, and I'm absolutely fascinated by them. I've got a kit, I'm building one in the back garden, and I've been exploring different ways that we might be able to some kind of dome structures together at Westonbirt. And these dome structures, I see them as sort of providing a bit like some of the earlier work at the Royal Festival Hall, like a cubicle or a space or an area that a person could go into and have reflective time in, but is also open. So it's got good ventilation, so it's a space where you can connect to the trees. Some of these drawings here, I'm thinking about, could we put like a telescope or a periscope up from the dome into the tree canopy? Could we have a big opening in the middle, like in a teepee, like a tent where you have a big opening, like would have been a smoke hole, but what if our smoke hole leads down to a mirror and you've got a mirror inside the dome that shows you the tree canopy above? Could they link together so that people could be in their safe bubbles but still communicate via a tube or via a pathway? And would these bubbles, these dome bubbles, have to be open rather than covered? So a bit like a den, but not fully enclosed, to allow a free passage of air and safe kind of space at this time in the sort of post-COVID society. So these are some of my thinking drawings, and I look forward to sharing more of my sort of scrappy drawings and ideas and working out processes with you through the residency. But I don't often make beautiful drawings. I quite often make scrappy little notebook drawings as a way of working out how things might look and how things fit together. So this is just an example of some of those really early ideas that might turn into something. The next stage would normally be to make models and test things out before going full scale. Oh, I just said I don't make drawings, and then there's a whole picture of drawings. So, okay, sometimes I do draw because, you know, I love spending time with the trees. So this is my sofa, which is just to the left there, and a collection of drawings that I've made of trees in the past using different mediums. So you've got pencil drawings there, there's coloured pencil, there's ink using brush, there's ink using pen, there's drawing activities where you don't take your pen off the page, there's some etching, there's some tracing, and for me this is like a really easy first step, you know, to actually get out in the environment and just spend some time sketching what we see, building a relationship with the environment around us. I think one of the most lovely things about drawing is not thinking about the outcome of like what it might turn out like or whether it will be a good drawing, but drawing as a process of looking, as a way of observing and engaging and exploring something in great detail. So I hope we'll get the chance to go out there and do that together, because it's also a way that we can develop our own, so through trying out different types of drawing. It would also give me a chance to meet you guys in your practice and see how you draw and see the differences and the commonalities between our different drawing techniques. So drawings are really kind of, I think, a good way into a project that can then lead to more kind of experimental ways of working after that. And that leads me on to kind of ideas about how we might engage in group workshops or engage with the public, Western Burt. And I think there's lots of different ways that this project can develop between us as a group, like without me having a set idea of what to create, of actually all of us working together to think about the different ways we might make structures, or the different aesthetic, the different colors, the different shapes, and also trying out some of this model making that I've been talking about. So the one in the middle here is a piece of work that I made with those homemade steam boxes. It's got kettles and steam going all through this installation, but essentially it's cardboard and duct tape, and the structure for making a geodesic dome is the same as a structure for building a football. So it's something that we can all have a go at and make quite easily, just using hexagons and pentagon shapes out of cardboard and sticking them together. There's also the potential of making models using rods or straws to create some shapes. So this is some of the ways that I'd like to engage the public as well, if we're at Western Burt, and start to create kind of like a collection of little models and ideas as a group that will inform what we create as a final piece of work. I've just got one more image here. And again, like the way that I see this project unfolding is that I can offer some points of inspiration and work with each of you to learn, for me to learn what you're interested in, and to help you find different ways into this work that resonates and feels really interesting to you. And one of the things with the cedar tree is that it's been used in so many different ways. So I've got some examples here of cedar shingles in a more sort of architectural or conventional building material. Cedar's often used. In the northwest coast of America and Canada, cedar trees are very prolific and they're used a lot in indigenous cultures. So these are all indigenous basket weavings made using the bark from a cedar tree, which is very thick, fibrous bark. Deep red color as well. You can soak it to take the dye from it. This is some printmaking from tree rings. Cedar was often used in canoe and boat building, so again, a more sort of functional, practical application there. I've already mentioned that it was used for its beautiful aroma and in the wood has kind of bubble kind of white and red pink patterns through it, so it's quite a beautiful wood to work with. And then traditionally, the native peoples of the Northwest Coast would use cedar quite a lot in their art and in their storytelling. So this is a chest that also has family clan symbolism on it, and sort of family stories told within the symbolism in the box there, and also a cedar mask that would have been part of a ceremonial performance and painted with pigments that are derived from the natural environment. So they're just a few of the different ways that you could work with cedar trees. And cedar is just one of hundreds of different tree specimens at Western Burt. So hopefully what we'll be able to do when we get out there is create personal relationships with the different trees, and either feed into this project together, and also develop your own individual pieces and responses to the wonderful environment at Western Burt. Like I said, it's so much at the beginning. I think it could change and develop in lots of different ways, but these are the ideas so far.